if you need to change the president, and you don't want to change him to Boehner or some other crazy person.
Tony, could you speak up a little bit, please?
Yes. If you must get this president out, and you don't like his rivals within the present government, what are you going to do? How could we possibly expect to have leadership that would do what LaRouche wants to do? Or that thinks about the world from the standpoint of saving the world? That's what you want in a leader, don't you? It's not enough to save the United States. You really do have to think about saving the world, because we're all in this together now, right? Isn't that true?
True.
So I recently wrote an article for the LaRouche magazine Executive Intelligence Review. You got a copy coming in. John F. Kennedy versus the Empire. Next month is the 50th anniversary of the murder of John Kennedy. A man who passionately cared about saving the world, and he was going to do it. Now, he didn't just come out of nowhere. He not only was a man who lived through a lot of history, not too much because he wasn't that old when they killed him, but he also studied American history and world history, and had a background which was moved. His own soul was moved by his family background. The reason we are publishing my article and other things now about Kennedy is to use the upcoming anniversary of his murder in this terrible, terrible crisis. You are privileged to feel nervous and bad. That's a privilege, because people who don't feel nervous and bad about this crisis are going like sheep to the slaughter, or they don't see the opportunity to do something about it. So we have this crisis, which is a gift from God, really, because natural law says that a crisis will have to come if you cheat people and destroy things. You're going to get a crisis, but that's an opportunity too. So Kennedy represents who we were as a country and what kind of leadership we had when we got what we deserve as a great nation and as human beings. So I'm going to discuss with you certain new discoveries about John Kennedy that are about our history. And I want you to, those of you who are able to, think with me as we discuss this. Some of you will be more able to do that than others. Some of you know more about it. It's not that you have to know more about it, it's that you have to be able to use your mind and your emotions and your heart also. Use your heart. Because this involves having enough courage to be hopeful. And hopeful in real terms because it's based on your need as an adult to do something about this. You're responsible. You're an adult. So Kennedy was born in 1917. He would be 96 this year if he were alive. Lyndon LaRouche is 91, right?
Yes.
So just about the same generation. He was 21 years old when his ultra-wealthy father, Joe Kennedy, went to England as Franklin Roosevelt's ambassador to England in 1938. And Joe Kennedy brought his son, along with the other 8 children, to England with him to live there for the 2 years that he was ambassador. He was scheduled to be ambassador maybe longer than that, but FDR pulled him out of there and said that he betrayed his trust. This was a time of tremendous peril and excitement in the world. It was just before what became World War II. And John Kennedy, being, a young adult, with his father the center of controversy, was alert and learning and forming his mind under crisis conditions and getting more and more passionate. Now, I said the word passionate. And maybe in some of your minds, that word is connected to sex. And then you say, oh, well, Kennedy was a sex fiend. He slept with Marilyn Monroe. He took drugs. He worked with the mafia. He was killed by UFOs. Right? All of these, gossip about Kennedy, but you don't know if that's all you know. You never heard about the person. You don't know anything about him. How did he think? What was on his mind? Oh, he had a mind? He thought something? Because if it's just gossip, then you are participating in this assassination yourself. Because you're saying, let's not pay any attention to that assassination. It wasn't about anything. So it's false. His outlook was shaped in a kind of a pull. His father had one point of view which was worse and worse up to a certain point when he sort of broke up and it was more of a broken man. His father was famous for being pro-Hitler. Not exactly true, but more or less. But that's not the real story. His father was really pro-British, and that's the problem. His father was a supporter of the British royal family and Lord Halifax and other leaders of the British aristocracy and banking elite that were supporting, sponsoring, paying for, and delivering weapons to Adolf Hitler. This was their project. Hitler was the project of the British crown, the British establishment, and the dominant figures of the British Empire. And Joe Kennedy had been an Irish American, and he betrayed this heritage and got himself money and power by associating himself with Wall Street and then getting backing by British banks, Graham and Company, a London and Indian Empire bank that got him into buying film companies and so forth, and he became a multimillionaire. John Kennedy felt in his heart that his own family background, his father's father and his mother's father, the Irish background was crucial. And his family had been fighting Britain for 150 years, actively, the empire in Ireland. His father's grandfather, Patrick Kennedy, was forced to leave Ireland while sick and decimated by the Great Famine in the 1840s, where the British Army had been the whole British Army was stationed in Ireland. And when they had a failure of the potato crop, the British Army supervised at gunpoint the export of food from Ireland, the export of cattle and wheat and all the food that they grew in abundance. Because they had the same potato famine in England, they wanted some of the food in England, they wanted to get money keep getting money from the Irish. So they starved millions to death in Ireland. And it was known as genocide, deliberate genocide by Bertrand Russell's grandfather, the Earl Russell, who was the Prime Minister of England at the time, deployed this army. So that great-grandfather came to America and died in Boston of the damage done by this famine. Even further back than that, Kennedy's family were anti-British. In the 1798 revolt in Ireland, they had an insurrection that was centered in Kennedy's county, Wexford. They had a Wexford Republic. That little county had its own republic with its own navy. And even into the 20th century, Kennedy's family were working with the Irish Republican Army, who were in a military struggle with the British. And then his family in Boston were Democrats, including his mother's father, the famous mayor of Boston, John Fitzgerald, who he was named after, Honey Fitz. Beautiful man, anti-British, American patriots, Irish patriots. And so Kennedy saw the problem with his father, that he's abandoning Roosevelt, who sent him over there to represent America, and here he becomes a stooge. Roosevelt, privately, but a lot, denounced Joe Kennedy as a disloyal and as being a stooge of the British. Not a stooge of Hitler, even though he supposedly supported Hitler. That's not the issue. The issue is that he supported the British. And FDR told the British, you have to stop backing Hitler. Because the British backed Hitler all the way up until he started to invade towards England in 1940.
So as he turned on them, how they discovered.
So Kennedy was a supporter then of Franklin Roosevelt and broke with his father's point of view decisively. His father had to come back to the United States disgraced because Roosevelt was popular and he wasn't. He wanted to be president, the father, but he never could. And his father still had his millions and said, well, I could have some power by having my son become president. So I'll back his political career with my money. And they loved each other, and that's what happened. The older brother died, who would have been, the first to be a politician, but he died in the war. John Kennedy went to war in the Pacific Ocean and was a hero in the Navy, and came out of that, and he was a journalist before and after the war as a young man, eyes wide open. His mind is hot. With inquiry, what are we going to do? What went wrong with the world that gave us Hitler and that gave us Roosevelt's enemies? Because when he got back from the war, Roosevelt's enemies had taken over the United States. There was a coup d'etat in the United States. It was called Harry Truman. That was a disaster. Who bombed Hiroshima? Who brought in what they call McCarthyism? Harry Truman. And who brought Truman in? Winston Churchill and the British and their friends in our country, like Averell Harriman, Dean Acheson, the Dulles brothers, and a clique of American Wall Street characters who are loyal to the British Empire and affiliated directly with the British Empire, and particularly with Churchill and some of the worst pro-fascists including Churchill, who was always a fascist throughout his life, except when he spoke against Germany, led by Hitler, when Germany was attacking them. Before that, a different story. So, in 1945, John Kennedy.
Why didn't he run for a second term if he had that back?
Who's that?
Why didn't Harry Truman run for a second term if he had that back and what happened?
Why did he run for a second term?
Why didn't he?
He ran for a term. He got his first term because Roosevelt died and he had been put in as
No,
vice
I know,
president.
what happened?
Then he ran again in 1952. I mean, in 1948. I'm sorry, 1948.
Yeah. And then he didn't run for a second term, which he was eligible for. And, you know, he
Well, neither did
retired.
Teddy Roosevelt.
But he,
Teddy
was he
Roosevelt
afraid
didn't
of
run.
being
It's a,
exposed?
I think that he wasn't very popular at that point. And
Oh.
Eisenhower was running too, right? Anyway,
Right.
so
Yeah, it's,
it's a good point. Let's get into that, into what Truman was, okay?
All right.
But there was a definite coup d'état, and I'm just looking at this through Kennedy's eyes, all right? He is a young man, and he's been in the war. He's a veteran, and he is dismayed, angry. Now we were supposed to finish World War II. We defeated all these Nazis and Japanese, and Mussolini got hung by his feet. So why are we still in what looks like a war with the Russians? What's going on? And even worse than that, why is the whole world denied American influence? Because all of a sudden, just like today, we're losing friends. Where are we losing friends? We're losing friends in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, South America. The communists are picking up friends. Why is that? Kennedy was not for communism. He saw that as a mistake, as an error, as foolish. But he also wasn't defined by that. He is an American. He's a nationalist. He studied Irish history. In his first speech as a man running for Congress in 1945, November 1945, his first speech to the American Legion in Boston was on the subject of England and Ireland, and contrasting Churchill and his party with FDR, and what's wrong with England. He's running for Congress in the USA. He had just been to Ireland and had met with leaders of the old insurrection of Ireland in 1922, the shooting war against the British intelligence that was done by Michael Collins and General Mulcahy, where they shot up the British Gestapo that was in Ireland and got the British to pull mostly out of Ireland. And he met with General Mulcahy, and he wrote this passionate speech to start his political career in America on this subject. So, he was elected to Congress, and he started to distinguish himself in American politics as the leader of the anti-imperialists in the United States politics. And unless you are some kind of a specialist in history, you cannot have any knowledge of this today, because it is erased from public discussion. You may not think about this. You may not even have considered that he gave a first speech. And what would that have been about? like Lincoln, you know, what was his first speech about? What was his politics about before he became president? You don't know that unless you have some special reason to know it, right? So in 1951, for example, he went on a tour as a congressman to the Middle East, Asia, and came back and gave a nationwide radio hookup report. And he said the problem in the world is imperialism. That you have Britain and their allies who are keeping as really like slaves the people of color and the people in Asia and the people who are Arabs. And the chief problem among the Arabs is poverty, and poverty is a result of being under the empires. So he has the same point of view as FDR. I'll get to that in a minute. And he said, this is outrageous. The Democrats under Truman and the Republicans under not just Eisenhower, but particularly under the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, Allen Dulles, head of CIA. They're all part of this little clique with Churchill. They've given us this crazy situation where the United States, against our own interests as a country, has gone in, since FDR died, with the British and the French and these other enemy empires. That's got to stop. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the U.S. having no influence and these people being destroyed. Now, I want to ask you, what's the background of this movement that was going on in Africa at the time and in the Arabs and in Asia called nationalism? What is nationalism? I want you to think about that, and I want to, if you'll bear with me, I want to give you a background on this so that you understand Kennedy's standpoint. Are you with me on this? Will you hang with me a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit and quickly go through what's the background of this nationalism. The United States is the origin of this third world nationalism. It came from America. It's originally an American movement. America is the originator of nationalism in the modern world. We had this in several waves, several American initiatives that brought this about. First one, of course, is our colonial and revolutionary experience. And you had American influence with Benjamin Franklin going over to Europe. Tremendous influence within England, starting up the Industrial Revolution as an American in England. His friends were the ones who started the Industrial Revolution that led to modern times. In England, it wasn't the bankers that did that. It wasn't the East India Company. It was Republican people. People believed in a republic. Or the friends of Benjamin Franklin was a scientist producing electricity. Electricity, power for mankind. He was a great scientist on electricity, not just for the country. Influence in Russia, influence elsewhere. And our revolution and our new constitutional government was seen by the world as a moment of dignity for mankind. Mankind can sit up straight now because we have this moment of dignity. The empire is still there. It's even still there in parts of the USA, right? It was in the South. We still had slavery, even though it was abolished in the North. That's part of the British Empire. Still, it was still plugged in to that. So we hadn't solved all these problems, but there was a new movement, and this had tremendous influence. And our nationalists here Hamilton and later Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams and our national bank and so forth built up things to give a change to the world. Skilled labor. What's a skilled labor job? It pays good wages. It means you know how to do something with machines. It means you can own your own home. It means you can know enough to prod the government to do what's right. You're not a peasant. It means you have a good standard of living. It means you can have an industry that could have inventions in it, or even as a worker you could have inventions. It means a lot of these things. That's a change in the whole human universe. That was originated here because there was an industrial revolution in England, but it didn't mean the standard of living of the population went up. They stole everything. Then we had outreach, and we started to spread the idea of building railroads to other countries. Our government was promoting that here. That was our system, not the British system. Our government said, it's a strategy. We're going to have canals, we're going to have railroads, military planned the railroads. We're going to have industries here that pay better wages, so we have tariffs to protect workers. So this is our system. It's a nationalist system. And people heard about this. They heard about it in Mexico, and they started a revolution there, 1811, against the Spanish with an American Constitution idea. And there was a British reaction. And they had people inside the USA that were allied to them in Boston that overturned the good influence of the good people in the colonial days. Some of the people in the colonial days were good men. You know, they wanted peace for the Indians. They wanted to have a good life. They wanted to have freedom. Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The British thought otherwise, the empire people. They brought in more slavery against that. They built up South Carolina on purpose as a slave operation. They made a whole slave empire all over the world with India. They spread the idea that the government shouldn't do anything for people, called free trade. And they thought that you should spread opium and narcotics, and that there's too many people in the world. That's Malthus, the British economist. It's all imperial. But they had people inside the United States like Aaron Burr and his projects like Andrew Jackson. And then they had people among the Southern aristocrats who were British affiliated, and the slave system itself. And then they sent August Belmont into New York, representing the Rothschilds. So they had Wall Street started up. That became bigger later. And we finally got to the point of a terrible crisis. The country was almost totally destroyed, and then Lincoln comes in. And boom! He mobilizes the country, mobilizes everything for war. What's his long-term purpose? Peace in the world. His second inaugural address is true. That's what he wanted. That's what he's aiming at. And that's what we had after he was done for a whole generation. But what did he mobilize? He mobilized the biggest army in the world for war. Yeah, he had to stop this war, stop the Confederates. But after the war, what's it about? Build railroads, steel mills, build steel mills. Government is going to make sure that they get protected from foreign competition, so you can have good wages. Free colleges, free land, high wages, science, electricity, backed by the people that backed Lincoln. We developed electricity. It was actually Franklin's associates who kept supporting Edison, and we built up public electricity. This was all taken out to the world, and the world responded to Lincoln. This was called 19th century nationalism. That's the way we look back on it. Because American nationalists said our government, our nation, has the right, and our people have the right to have a government that is going to protect the people. How does it protect the people? By letting them vote Well, that's part of it, I suppose. But it protects the people by actually making sure that they have a better conditions, modern conditions, right? Real jobs, real conditions for raising a family. And that the British Empire and Wall Street do not control anything. And in fact, you begin to mobilize other countries to stand with you against these powerful money interests and imperialists. So we reached out directly through Henry Carey and other means to Germany, Japan, and Russia. And there were real revolutions in those countries. I'm talking about way before the so-called Russian Revolution, when they started to introduce powerful modern industry under American influence. We spread modern times to many other countries. And that was cut off by the British. They said, we can't let this go into Africa. We can't let the Arabs have it. We can't let this spread to China. They did many things to bring about a dark age in the world because they were frightened at America's developing this nationalism. So there was movements like eugenics and various other crazy things that came out of England in those days to support the empire. And then you had World War, you had Depression, you had terrible times in the 1920s and 30s. You had war raging all over the world and fascism that came out of the British Empire and came out of their friends in continental Europe. And in this period, Franklin Roosevelt came up, and he was a man of his own dignity, and the world saw that he was coming up, and the USA was coming up to bring the common man out of the dust and out of this terrible time. And this thrilled the world, and it thrilled people in Africa and in the Middle East and in Asia. And his war aims were world peace and world development and end the empires. He developed the Tennessee Valley Authority, electricity for the people, and atomic energy, so that the world could soar, mankind could soar with great power. That was the objective, great power for the populations of the world. And the world responded. One of the men that responded was later a great ally of John Kennedy. His name was Kwame Nkrumah. He was a young man from the British colony called Gold Coast on the west coast of Africa, and he, Nkrumah, and he was in the United States for 10 years under Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. And he was particularly inspired by the Tennessee Valley Authority because he thought building dams would be great for my country in Africa, which is so backward under the British. When I go back to Africa and overthrow the British rule there and Americanize that place, I'm going to get electricity. And we're going to industrialize Africa. I'm going to do that. Why shouldn't I be the savior of Africa? Industrialize. Electricity. Yeah. So he went back to the Gold Coast, and he actually led the first successful overturning of British rule in the late 1950s. Martin Luther King went there for his for the change to what the new name of the country, Ghana, and then Kennedy became his friend. India was freed under Nehru and Gandhi. It wouldn't have been freed without Franklin Roosevelt challenging the British and saying, you have to get rid of them, get rid of the suppression of India. South Africa, they heard about the Atlantic Charter of Franklin Roosevelt, the guaranteed freedom for all the countries. That stirred them up. So there was a revolution in what we call the third world, or the underdeveloped countries, called the revolution of rising expectations, rising from traditional societies, the oppression of traditional societies, where people have relatively nothing, rising from the oppression of imperialism, where they're robbed by the Europeans, rising from the oppression of the Depression collapse that we had in the 30s. And so people suddenly saw that they had, in response to Roosevelt, that they had a chance to make their future as sovereign nations, and America would back them up against the empires. Oh my God, what happened at the end of World War II? Truman and Churchill and these various Wall Street and other goons said, no, we didn't mean it. America doesn't exist as a republic. It's just Wall Street. John Kennedy comes into that and says, wait, this is wrong. So what did he do? That's his point of view. That's what he knew when he came in to politics. He was in the Congress, and then in 1952 he was elected to the Senate. From 1953 to 1960 he was a U.S. Senator. And he was more famous among these foreign countries than he was here in the United States, because he was the leader of this movement for the end of imperialism. And he's aiming at the presidency the whole time. 1954, he wrote a book called 54 and 5 called Profiles in Courage, an anti-British. The first chapter is the main thing. Read that, and then you can get your key to it. It was his Declaration of Independence. It's focused on John Quincy Adams. 1956, he gave a speech to the Irish Americans saying, put aside your resentments against England. Resentment is not a good basis for doing any good. It's a good basis maybe for stirring you up, but put it to good use. We need to end the empire now. Don't tell me about past wrongs. Help me to reorient America to get back on the track where we were with FDR. And take care of the fact that we should be helping these nationalists and not saying, oh, they're communists or they're Muslim terrorists or whatever they say now about various people that are not part of the establishment, right? And in that speech to the Irish, he said, the British assassinate people, historically. You have to live with that, so what? That's a fact. British assassination. And he gave a poem about that. Read the speech. St. Patrick's Day, 1956. In 1956 also, he gave a speech about race. I'll give you one paragraph. June 2nd, 1956. I want to discuss with you today the growing and recurrent problem of colonialism, nationalism, and the attitude of the United States and our allies. Our course in Indochina under the Democrats and Republicans antagonized the Vietnamese people and refueled the propaganda machines of the Viet Minh communists. We can never escape the fact that we are dependent upon the decisions of people in those countries who have hated, as their ancestors before them for centuries hated, the white men who bled them, beat them, exploited them, and ruled them. Perhaps it's already too late for the U.S. to repudiate these centuries of ill will and to firmly but boldly press for a new generation of friendship among equal and independent states. We dare not fail to make the effort. The U.S. Senator, John Kennedy. 7 years later, the last year of his life as president, 63, his famous speech on civil rights. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. But this isn't Obama, by the way, talking about how he now supports the civil rights movement, even though he wasn't part of it earlier. This is John Kennedy at a time when his life was in danger to make the speech, all right?
When is that speech?
It's June 11th, 1963. Yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free from the bonds of injustice, from social and economic oppression. And then he asked, who are we as Americans? What are we, what is America to the human race? This is what he said. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is a land of the free except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race except with respect to Negroes? The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. This is before the riots. So he's talking about the mental fires, where legal remedies are not at hand. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and as a people. Next week, I will ask Congress to make real changes. And so the first civil rights bill since the Civil War was put in by John Kennedy. It wasn't originated by Lyndon Johnson. It came from Kennedy. Johnson pushed it forward. But so now, he had friends among these third world leaders. I'll get to that in a second. To establish his thinking. Now, this may be a little of a shocker for you. In 1959, the Catholic bishops of the United States came out with a policy that repudiated an idea that the British were circulating at the time called population reduction.
What was the date?
1959. Yeah, hold on a second. Let me get this. Okay, here we are. A government committee in 1959, headed by William F. Draper, released a report calling for a U.S. government program of population reduction for the people of color in the foreign countries. And Kennedy was interviewed in the New York Times. And Kennedy was a senator, and he's running for president. And Eisenhower didn't say much about this. Some part of his government had issued this report. So he was asked about this, and here's what Kennedy said. The Catholic bishops, he was asked, they said the Catholics won't support having the government promote artificial birth control or sterilization or abortion. What's your position on this? This is for foreign countries, particularly, Africa, Asia, you get it, right? So Kennedy said, I think it would be a mistake for the United States government to attempt to advocate the limitation of the population of underdeveloped countries. This problem involves important social and economic questions, which must be solved by the people of those countries themselves. For the United States to intervene on this basis would involve a kind of mean paternalism, which I think they would find most objectionable. Oh, well, is your position on this influenced in any way by the pronouncement of the 16 Roman Catholic bishops in Washington last Wednesday? No, my judgment on this has been held for many years, and it continues. You mean your present views are not the result of this statement by the bishops? Typical New York Times, right? Well, let me say this. No. The question we all have to address ourselves to is whether the available resources of the world are increasing as fast as the population. That's the overall question. My belief is that they are, though their management may not be. That's shorthand for guess who owns these resources and what they're doing with them. The world is full of resources they never touched, right? What's Africa got in resources?
Tons of wonderful.
You think about diamonds and gold. Well, that's just trash. How about iron? How about other things that are really valuable? How about land for growing crops? How about rivers? All right, those are resources. Nevertheless, we have to be very careful about how we give advice on this subject. The United States government does not advocate any policy concerning birth control here in the United States, nor have we ever advocated such a policy in Western Europe. Accordingly, I think it would be the greatest psychological mistake for us to appear to advocate the limitation of the black or brown or yellow peoples whose population is increasing no faster than the United States. They must reach decisions on these matters based on their own experience and judgment. His Democratic Party rivals broke with him. Adlai Stevenson and Humphrey criticized him and supported the Draper report for population limitation. Eisenhower then publicly announced the U.S. government would have nothing to do with birth control. So he was influenced by Senator Kennedy. So the position of the U.S. government going against reducing the world's population on the British program comes from John Kennedy. Now, the day before he gave this interview, there was a British guy in America named Julian Huxley. And he gave a public speech on the anniversary of Charles Darwin's book. And at that time, this British guy, a really high up British man, grandson of Thomas Huxley, he was a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, a place where they turn out New Age cult liberals and right-wing proto-Nazis. Both come out of the University of Chicago. Terrible place. University of Chicago. There's a few good people from there, but that's where he was. So it's Rockefellers. So this guy Julian Huxley gave a speech in response to these Catholic bishops, and he said, well, we need to have a change in thinking in the USA, and we need to have birth control in the world so that we can reduce the world's population, substantially reduce the world's population. We also need to have new education that will eliminate this old American myth of equality. And we need to get rid of this terrible thing which is interrupting and interfering with world affairs called nationalism.
Mrs. Huxley.
Now, this is Julian Huxley. Meanwhile, his brother, Aldous Huxley, then in California, started being in the film industry and later on in narcotics with the CIA and things like that. He gave a speech about why we need to cut the world's population, but we should look forward to a new era where we don't have manufacturing jobs anymore, where we're into service and entertainment as a way of life. Yeah, that's what happened. How'd they get that to happen? They killed our president, and then they killed his brother. How'd they get that to happen?
Paul Harvey used to
So this guy, Julian Huxley, who was former president of the British Eugenics Society and a favorite of the royal family of England. In 1961, after John Kennedy became president, Julian Huxley wrote a report for Prince Philip of England. And it was called the Morges Manifesto. It's in my article. Morges. It's a town in Switzerland where they were starting up a new organization. And this is right after Kennedy became president. They felt they needed to get a new movement started to counter Kennedy, because he's bad news. And what was this new British organization? It was to be called the World Wildlife Fund. Now, this is April of 1961. In January, he's inaugurated. In January of 1961, John Kennedy's inaugurated January 20th. 3 days before that inauguration, the British Secret Service and the American CIA, led by Alan Dulles, part of this clique that's working with the British, killed the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. So there's chaos in the Congo. And there's chaos in a lot of places when John Kennedy came in. Keep this in mind for a second. He's coming into office. And he's made speeches about Algeria. That was his most famous speech. Give independence to the Arabs of Algeria. Stop supporting the French war against Algeria. Stop supporting the British policy. Let these people have their freedom. And he worked with the Arabs to get that going. He wanted peace in those regions. Peace, not war, not ethnic or religious war. And so when he came in to office, what happened? Just before he came in office, there was an attack against him by this clique of the British Secret Service and the CIA. They organized the Bay of Pigs, which is a crazy invasion of Cuba, and they used extortion and blackmail to get Kennedy to go along with this, and he was confused about what he was going to do. And when he just took office, that was handed to him, a terrible fiasco. They murdered Patrice Lumumba. They told the people in Algeria, who were the Europeans working with the British and French against the Arabs, that they could overthrow the government of France, now led by Kennedy's new friend, de Gaulle. Because de Gaulle was thinking, like Kennedy, that we should end this empire. He changed under Kennedy's influence, part of that. So the CIA and the British intelligence working together against America's interests and against the president's own statements that we're on the side of this independence movement. He said, no, we're going to work with these Nazis in North Africa, these European Nazis who are British controlled. So all this is happening before, and they even ran a raid against the dollar from Wall Street in London to weaken his whole position when he's coming in as president. But in 1961, in April, they started this World Wildlife Fund with this declaration. And what did they say about this chaos? What did they say? There was chaos in Africa, right? There was thousands dying in chaos and war and strife. Millions being uprooted from their homes. They said in this declaration, thousands are dying. Millions are being uprooted from their homes. But they weren't talking about people. They were talking about wildlife. And wildlife. We have to protect the wildlife. And the way we'll protect the wildlife is to stop what is killing them and displacing them. Homes for the Africans, electricity for the Africans. That's what's causing the problem. Don't you see? And so the implicit message is this new American president better watch his step. Because he says he's going to go on their side. He's made a pact with the Prime Minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, to make a great dam on the Volta River and electrify West Africa and industrialize Africa as the goal. So this manifesto says we're going to set up a worldwide operation. We'll have a core group of billionaires that will support this. This is in the manifesto, published April 61. Look on the World Wildlife website. And that we're going to coordinate from our headquarters a war room with all the other new things that will come up in so-called environmental movements. And that's our movement. That's imperialism. That's the green agenda. Search your own heart, how you feel about this, and see what's wrong with the way you feel about it, or your friends. Search your heart. What happened? How did this concept of human rights get abandoned in the time after Kennedy's murder? The right to a decent living standard for human beings. That was what it meant to be an FDR liberal, right? Or a Franklin liberal. It's not a British liberal. Like, we care so much about the animals. We care so much about your sex life. We get involved so much in your sex life, right? We care deeply. Oh, wait a minute. You don't care about what happens to people? They're murdered in wars. They lose their jobs. Doesn't affect your mind at all. That's the new liberal, right? That's the British liberal, the fascist liberal. So, what did Kennedy do? He actually did finance that dam. But let me tell you about his clashes with the British, and that's what I'm going to wind up with here. And that'll define his presidency. Just bear with me a second. Take a deep breath here. Here we go. Too many pieces of paper. So, in the Congo, he had a shooting war with the British. He finally solved the Congo problem, at least while he was alive. And he backed the United Nations to go in there and gave American arms to the UN, not to break up the country like we do now with civil wars, but to end the civil war by keeping the government in power and stopping the British from having a secession of the mineral part of the country so they could loot the minerals. The Congo government demanded the withdrawal of the British consul. Students stormed the British embassy and destroyed Queen Elizabeth's portrait. These are Congolese students. Then the students marched to the U.S. embassy and cheered for the USA. Kennedy's our president. He's facing down the British. And the New York Times reported that the British were fearful that a Congo regime supported by this UN, i.e. Kennedy's UN, would use its position to subvert the present regimes in the Rhodesias, Portuguese colonies, and South Africa. Wouldn't it be terrible if all those colonial regimes and their race policies was overthrown, according to the New York Times? And it's published in a British paper. We have witnessed 3 attempts at world domination, first by Hitler, then by Stalin, now by President Kennedy. That was in the Daily Telegraph.
Who said that?
It was a letter in the Daily Telegraph. That was their idea. That was their point of view. Kennedy's the new Hitler or Stalin, right? But in the United States, he had a showdown. And he got the British they had to back down in the Congo and give up this revolution there. He had a showdown with the steel industry. And this is very famous, the steel crisis in 1962. And what happened is that the leading steel company, United States Steel, was set up by the Morgan Bank, which is a British and Wall Street bank. And they were the leading company still after they made a monopoly there. Took over these companies, many companies, and made a monopoly in steel. They didn't own all the companies, but so in 1962, Kennedy challenged the steel industry in a good way. And he said, I'm trying to build up a bigger and better steel industry. I want higher wages and higher profits, but I can't get that all at once. The way we need to do this is by having investment in new plants and equipment. We need new science, new technology. We need to expand the whole scope so that we get a new generation of workers and public a better situation. And so I'm asking the steel union, the United Steelworkers, and the steel companies to hold off on increases in the wages and the prices. They should get higher benefits in the steel union, but not a higher wage right away. Because what I'm going to do is going to lead to a lot higher wages. So then the steel companies and the union agreed to this, and Kennedy, as soon as the workers signed the contract, the head of U.S. Steel came to Kennedy and said, we just raised our prices, ha ha. Slap in the face at the president, make him look bad. What? Raised their prices against the agreement. They didn't have to sign an agreement, it was a behind the scenes agreement. But this is Wall Street, because Kennedy had a program that was going to increase the profits of steel companies. And this company was against it. The Morgan Bank that owned the U.S. Steel was against that. They didn't want to make profits making steel. They were part of the British and Wall Street philosophy. That was their main concern. They made money by speculation. They made money by stealing from a lot of countries. They made money by criminal means in various ways. More than the money was power. And they saw their power with the British and related imperial interests in crushing down the American population and the idea of nationalism everywhere. And so they were not in favor of the investment tax credit that Kennedy put through. They were against that. That would have increased steel profits in the steel industry. Kennedy went to war, a 72-hour war, that he sicked the Justice Department on it. That was handy because his brother was the Attorney General. And he got the Defense Department to end contracts with companies that raised their prices, that followed U.S. Steel to do that. And they had to back down because with all those things, they were about to be put in jail at Morgan Bank. Plus, and what does Obama do with Morgan Bank?
He loves them.
Right? George Bush. Right? That's their people, right? That's their people. Not even Obama's people, he still bows to them. Right? So, the secret ingredient in that steel crisis was that there was a company called Kaiser Steel, K-I-S-E, K-A-I-S-E-R, headed up by Edgar Kaiser, son of Henry J. Kaiser. And this guy he ran the steel company, the aluminum company. He had built dams with his father, he built Liberty ships with his father during World War II. And he was the supervisor in Ghana, in Africa, for Kennedy's joint project with Kwame Nkrumah to build the dam. The great dam that was being built with U.S. backing on the Volta River, called the Akasambo Dam. Look it up. It's the largest artificial lake in the world to the present day. You see it from space. It looks like most of Ghana from space. And it makes this power for West Africa. He was the one who was supervising that. U.S. Steel and the Morgan interests hated him, and they were in a war with him. They set up rival steel plants and tried to put him out of business. So it's a philosophy war. It's our side, the American side, versus the British side, versus the imperial side. So the final thing with Kennedy was he said, how did we get in the Cold War? How did we get in this showdown with Russia and communism? It was a British setup. It was a Wall Street setup. It was not necessary. Does he like communism? No, it's a mistake. It's wrong. What does that have to do with anything? Do you like Al-Qaeda? Do you like fanatical, crazy Muslims who distort the religion and carry out terrorism? No, I don't think that's right. I don't want any country led by that. But is that a justification for bombing countries and going to having your own crazy policy? No, it's insane. You're being guided by insane people on both sides. You're insane yourself to have that policy, to be a dupe to these rich men that guide this thing, like those fanatics are. So he said, we're going to end the Cold War. We're going to end this showdown with the Russians. Now, he ran into a problem in Cuba to begin with his CIA and British intelligence setup at the Bay of Pigs. And then in 1962, he had another problem when the Soviet Union saw America getting too powerful under John Kennedy. He built up the U.S. military, not intending to have any wars. He wanted peace. He built up our industry. He built up our science. He built up the economy to a greater height than it ever was, to a greater dynamism than at any other time in history. Wages and profits. And the Russians saw that they were going to lose out in this Cold War. And so they tried an adventure of putting nuclear bombs on missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from our country. And Kennedy said, no, we're not going to let you do that because that would lead to a nuclear war. And so you have to take them out of there. And he put very carefully, he had learned from the Bay of Pigs situation that he had to personally control what the government was doing. Isn't that what a president should do? Not listen to these fakers that are put in there by Wall Street or otherwise incompetent. And he was competent because he was a thinker and he knew something. He'd done his work, and he had his spark of genius, like typical American of all kinds. Could you have a spark of genius, right? That's our country. That's what it's about. So he controlled this showdown with the Russians, Cuban Missile Crisis, without humiliating them. Got them out, got them to back down. And from that point on, said, we want to cooperate with you and have world peace. So what did he do? The first thing was to try to settle things down, get back away from this terrible danger, which we still have, unfortunately, today, now again, of nuclear war. He signed a treaty with the Russians to stop the testing of atomic bombs in the atmosphere, which is not only bad for the atmosphere, but it makes people really nervous and trigger happy, and everybody wants to get an A-bomb. So they signed a treaty against that. They stopped that. The Russians were really excited about this. He gave a speech at the American University, June 11th, 1963, Strategy for Peace. And he said, Americans, rethink your silly attitudes towards Russia. No country is purely bad. Russia went through World War II with us as our ally. Russia suffered more than we did. Russia's a great country with their science. They're a large country like we are. We've never had a war with them. Reconsider your attitudes. Implicitly, he's saying that's totally foolish. The next day, he gave this speech about civil rights where he said, re-examine your race attitudes. So he's really challenging the American people to reconsider the way they think. Not going with public opinion. That's how he celebrated John Quincy Adams. He went against public opinion. Profiles in courage. And then finally, he said, you know what? I don't think we should go to the moon as America. I think that we should do it jointly with the Russians.
And you did.
Well, we didn't, because he was murdered. We ended up going ourselves. The Russians sort of faded away. But we took the leadership under Kennedy, first in a race with the Russians, but then he said, let's shift this. And when he was murdered, he was in the middle of a shift of the entire situation to have a joint moon landing by the United States and the Soviet Union. And this was going on for increasingly faster and faster. Just before his murder, November 12th, 1963, 10 days before his murder, he issued a national security memorandum, you can look it up, directed to the administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, James Webb, that he should personally take control of our negotiations and contacts with the Russians, with the Soviet Union, on the joint space program. And because there's people in my government who are not for this. You have to personally run this, and I want you particularly to work this, keep working this through the Soviet Academy of Sciences. That's crucial, because that's where we had our scientists and the Russian scientists who were specialists in anti-Newton science, turbulence. You know, what Newton and his people would say is abnormal. Well, they would say everything is abnormal because they don't have a good idea. They say the universe is dead.
Didn't they incorporate some of the German scientists from the outset?
Yeah, they did. He worked with the best of them, you know. But the important thing in this regard is that he changed our policy, and the Russians were cooperating with us in this direction. And so, and then just days before he was murdered, he was working through a man named Atwood to set up a détente with Fidel Castro. And we had contacts with Castro and his immediate staff that went around Che Guevara, because he was too much of a fanatic, and said, look, Castro was tired of being just a patsy for the Russians, and he wanted to establish good relations with the United States, and Kennedy thought that was a good idea. So get out of this. Just drop the whole Cold War. So you figure out what he was going to do in Vietnam from that standpoint. Get the whole picture. Don't get some gossip or some particular piece of paper or some single issue that somebody told you. He said, we're taking 1,000 troops out by Christmas. We had advisors there. There were no combat troops. There was no battalions there for U.S. combat. This is something that was left over from the Dulles era. And he's trying to get out of there. Just before he was murdered, John Kennedy U.S. financed a nuclear reactor for Vietnam. And the president of Vietnam commissioned that and dedicated that. A few days before that, President Diem of Vietnam was himself assassinated, followed by the assassination of President Kennedy. They actually got the reactor started in the middle of then what became a war under Lyndon Johnson and these crazies that took over our country after Kennedy was murdered. And then they couldn't do anything with a nuclear reactor in the middle of a war, so they just let it molder. Then Israel. This is the last thing I'll tell you. He was a friend of a lot of Jewish people. He was not a friend of imperialism. And he admired nationalism of all nations. So when the British and French made a deal with Israel in 1956 to lure Israel into invading Egypt to overthrow Kennedy's friend Nasser, later Kennedy's friend, because Kennedy wasn't president then. The British-French alliance, through the French government, gave nuclear weapons technology to the Israelis. And the Israelis were interested in nuclear science, but also nuclear weapons because they were frightened of the Arabs. And the British and French wanted Israel to have nuclear weapons so they could keep a war and terrorizing people in the Middle East. Keep it unstable. And when Kennedy became president, Israel had not yet built any atomic bombs. They had a station in Dimona, Israel, that was built by under the leadership of the French fascist Jacques Cousteau, who was the Minister of Atomic Energy in 1958 and 59 and betrayed de Gaulle and did this, setting up this nuclear weapons development in the Israeli desert. Kennedy said to the Israelis, we want to have inspectors go in there and see that you're not making A-bombs. And was he opposed to Israel and trying to hurt them? No, he wanted to save them. You think the present situation is good for Israel? To have a crazy man running the country and to have war all around them and nuclear threats and all this stuff back and forth? That's insane. How long can the insanity continue? You think you can live like that forever? That's insane. Kennedy tried to head it off. So what did he say? What did he propose instead of nuclear weapons? And then the Arabs are supposed to get nuclear weapons to defend themselves. That's crazy, right? What did he say instead? He said, let us get nuclear power plants for Israel and the Arabs, and to have them jointly develop projects that would use especially nuclear power plants to take the salt out of seawater, where you can do it cheaply with a nuclear power plant if you develop that for that purpose. Africa and the Middle East are surrounded by water. Look at the globe. Look at the map. There's water everywhere. How come there's not a drop to drink? Right? Get the salt out of the seawater or move the rivers. But it's easier to desalt it if you have nuclear power. So he said, let's set up joint projects. And he got Israel and Egypt and other Arab and North African countries and Russia and Mexico to take part in the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, in the great project to make nuclear desalination. He changed the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and oriented it around this great project, that the world will have all the fresh water it needs and no conflict over water. And that's our American commitment. And beyond that, he said, September 1963 at Hanford, by the end of this century, half of all electric energy generated in the United States will come from nuclear sources. And after 2000, virtually all new electric power stations will be nuclear. John Kennedy. We're going to the moon, but that's not our objective. Our objective is beyond there to Mars and the outer planets. But first, Mars. You can't get to Mars without a nuclear rocket. and really ultimately a fusion rocket. They're working under Kennedy on a nuclear fission rocket. First stage, nuclear fission, so you get the concept. And we had this project site out in Nevada. And you can go on the internet and look at the pictures of Kennedy with the AEC commissioner, Seaboard. They're at the test site for the nuclear rocket to Mars. You have to go accelerate all the way to Mars to go there efficiently. You can't do it in a year, you have to do it in a week, or you'll be destroyed. So that was our commitment. That was the world of the future, not the World Wildlife Fund, not terrorism and counterterrorism, not austerity and cutbacks. So he raised the minimum wage. He got people jobs. He secured increases in the so-called entitlements. How could you pay for that? Increase industry. It's what we always did from the beginning. Just create more wealth. Real wealth. Physical wealth. Wealth from real science, not entertainment screens, but science that controls nature. And that means the human mind has to be free to be able to organize itself to protect the people of the country in that way. But that's what we lost. That future was stolen from our then younger generation and today's younger generation who doesn't know anything about it. Now we have a chance to get it back. So I want you to help me circulate this to young people, especially college campuses, high schools, parents, and anybody who wants to have a future, even if they're 70 or 80 years old today. Get this idea out. We have a right to have this back. That's our country. That's who we are as a country. And if you don't agree with John Kennedy, that's your right. But he was America's constitutionally elected president, and that government was overthrown by the assassination of Kennedy, by this assassination capability that I mentioned. The joint British and CIA under the guy that he fired, Alan Dulles, he fired him. He fired the head of the CIA. He fired the second in command of the CIA, Charles Cabell, who was part of this development of the Algerian gang and all these people that Kennedy was fighting. And he fired those guys. Cabell was investigated by Jim Garrison in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. DA, the district attorney in New Orleans. Cabell's brother, Earl Cabell, was the mayor of Dallas when Kennedy was murdered there. So you don't need to go looking in various little documents and under this and that, oh my God, where's the bullet? Where's the magic bullet? You don't need to do that. You don't need to go looking through the rubble at the World Trade Center to find out who did it or what happened, or if you could only tell people one little fact, then everything would be changed. No, that's not true. You need more than one little fact or one little theory. You have to face what went wrong with our people as well as the leadership. And let's get it back, because we're in such a terrible crisis that people will listen now and they're pissed off. Okay? So, questions? Yes.
Well, you asked what nationalism is. It's the theory and belief that a nation should consider itself a nation apart from other nations and have its own sovereignty. As a nation.
Yes.
That would be the definition of nationalism. That doesn't mean it's evil, like to aggress against other countries or so on. But it just means that a country is nationalistic in that sense, that it considers itself this country and it has its own sovereignty.
Yes.
And no other country should aggress on it.
Right. And this is a crucial thing that you bring up. That it doesn't mean this evil thing of being against other countries. or being at war with other countries, or hating other countries, because then you're being manipulated by somebody that's above both countries to make you a fool to fight against your neighbor or some other religion or something, right? There's even more a way of looking at this, I would say. And you have this among countries that, on a positive side, think about the Irish. Or any nationalist that is thinking about changing the world, not just his own nation, wanting to contribute to something, right? Like the American nationalists, they were thinking about humanity in general. And there's a way that this gets twisted around. And I would raise this for, just hold on one second, okay? Just 1 second. Jewish people and black people. We have some of both here in this audience and sitting at this platform. And so think about this. The Jewish people were the conscience of Europe, and in many other countries as well, in Spain and elsewhere. What happened with Netanyahu, with all this crazy stuff? What happened to this? It didn't start with that. I'll tell you, my father was the leader of a boycott against Nazi Germany in 1933. He was the lawyer for the boycott. He was the legal strategist, the American Jewish Congress, and fought the Wall Street companies that were working with Hitler at that time. And there was a section of the so-called Jewish community that was run by these bankers. And they had Jewish names and backgrounds, but they weren't looking out for Jewish people. It's good to look out for Jewish people if you're Jewish, and that would mean you're trying to do some good for the world, not obliterate it. So, the same thing with black people today. I mean, the black community in not just Washington, D.C., but that's a good example, but elsewhere in this country, historically has been the conscience of this country, beyond looking out for black people, which is important because nobody else would. But they were also the conscience of other people because they were fighting for some progress, and that progress would help everybody. That's why Martin Luther King would have made a good president, because he was trying to help everybody, right? Isn't that true?
Yeah.
If you were of good will. If he wasn't trying to help you, then you were doing something wrong. That's all. So how did black people then give that up and support the present government that's doing so crazy, that's doing so terrible wrong, and hasn't helped any poor people, and is hurting all the people in Africa and all these other countries? How does that happen? Because you have something that was changed in America after the Kennedy brothers and King were murdered. You have the whole culture of the country put off the rails because we used to be so concerned. Look back to the history of these different groups. We used to be really concerned and burning with interest to help people to come up in the world, right? To help people that were not rich like we were. This is the common interest of the rich and poor, and that's what Kennedy was interested in. Yeah.
Yeah. When I was in Africa in the late 60s, I noticed that this effect, you see, the early 60s in Africa, you had these independence movements that were trying to be nationalist based. But what you had that evolved after that was done by the British, and I noticed how they did it. They took people who were in rebellion against these nationalist type groups that had won their first revolution or second revolution, whatever. And they started third and fourth revolution on groups that were so-called tribal based. In other words, get back to acting like Africans. What they did,
What
the
the
way
British
they
defined as
manipulated
Africans.
it, was they told the African population that these Africans who had started these nationalist groups for independence were actually making you act like white people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's
And
the British line.
because of
The British
this,
line.
they were like saying these people are evil, these are wrong, you know, and it caused intertribal warfare, which destroyed further, and you were getting like fourth and fifth revolutions in some of these countries, where the
That's
initial
exactly right.
the initial people that started the revolution.
Had been overthrown or murdered. There was a
Yeah.
whole set of murders in Africa of African leaders
Of
at the
African
same
leaders.
time as the
And
Kennedy
thing is, these
assassination.
were educated leaders
Assassinated?
that were murdered. Educated leaders.
That's right.
Because like, when I went to Mogadishu and they first got their independence, okay, they were first getting their independence, there was like 3 universities and a college in Mogadishu.
Yeah, that's in Ethiopia.
There were fully
Right.
functional
Somalia.
universities
Somalia.
with graduating students and everything, white and black, okay? And these were working institutions. I came back another trip a couple of years later, there were like 2 colleges left, okay? I came back on a trip way later, and by the time I got there in the 80s, the thing, General Adid, who the UN condemned, was trying to hold what was left together of Mogadishu. General Adid was no Boy Scout, but he was a lot better than what was waiting to take over. Okay? And he was condemned in the United Nations. And the British led that condemnation. But he was their man when he took over originally. You know, the way they played the game. The way they played the game.
Yeah, so
And when he went out, that was it told. But by that time, there was like one professor at the university who was trying to keep the library going and trying to, you know, have some things functioning. There were virtually no students.
So let's try to, now that you've said that, and that's crucial, try to use that to refocus on the point. The United States had a contrary policy to what we have now, which is this crazy British policy of constant overthrow, constant turmoil, wars, counter wars. You know, we're going to protect human rights. Well, what was the human rights? There was a human rights revolution in the world. It was called the Industrial Revolution that brought to mankind, especially after the American entry of electricity and high-wage steel jobs and cities, modern cities and sanitation, all these things, that brought, look at what happened in Japan. Look at that change. From feudalism into a situation, especially after we crushed feudalism the second time. Women's rights, labor union rights, all kinds of things. That's part of modern conditions. Do you have human rights in a condition of constant war and chaos and revolution and revolution again? No. You have it when there's a high living standard. You didn't have it in England with the Industrial Revolution because they stole all the time. Yeah.
You had said something about the trip to go to Mars.
I'm sorry, say it again?
You said something about the trip to go to Mars.
Yes.
It takes about a week.
It takes about, using a chemical rocket like we have now, it would take about a year.
The propulsion system, what type of system that would be?
The problem, he says, what kind of propulsion system do you need? The problem is that you have to accelerate all the time in order to keep gravity on the ship. And you have to accelerate all the time to get there fast which you need to do because if you're weightless or in space, even unshielded from cosmic rays, you're going to be wrecked, maybe killed for a year. Plus you'll go nuts from the boredom. So it's only effective to go there really fast. And you can't use a chemical-based rocket to constantly accelerate. You'd have to take 1 million tons of fuel with you, which you couldn't ever get off the ground, right? So you need a very efficient rocket like nuclear to get you there in 10 days instead of a year. And we were working on that as our program. That the Kennedy program originally was to have people land on Mars in the 1970s. That was then changed right after he was murdered to the 1980s and then given up altogether. And now it's been closed down altogether. But that's you need the best kind of fuel, the best kind of rocket will be thermonuclear. And LaRouche is talking about that, how to do this. And this is the revolution we need. But that gives you all kinds of resources. But the fuel for thermonuclear fusion rocket, the best would be the helium-3 isotope, which is found in large quantities on the moon. Go back there and mine it. People today think of the moon like people used to think of California. It's a long way away and we'll never get there. Well, we were already there. It's so crazy that people say we didn't even go there. Right? So just go back and get on with the project. We were doing this already. Yeah.
Yeah, in
You next.
the context of what Kennedy, the environment that he was in, when so much has been suppressed or just not talked about, Roosevelt had a very long run. It involved a period of war. Same for Lincoln. So it seems though they distort things, and you know, Roosevelt comes under attack a lot, all kinds of slander as well. It's more difficult. They kind of stand up. Where Kennedy, there seems to be a real effort to minimize his
Well, they
effect.
stand up against the slanders. Okay, well,
Right now, one of the slanders or misconceptions that they like to put out about Kennedy, I'm wondering, hoping you can address.
Yeah.
You talked about the civil rights speech,
yes.
but that he was not really supportive, that he was slow. I mean, I think I remember one of the demonstrations where it was legal for blacks to demonstrate, and Martin Luther King was moving in on that. That it was not approved by the White House or supported by Washington. And again, it's important. I like what you're laying out because you have to see that it's almost a warlike environment that he's in.
Yes.
That he's kind of Caesar, surrounded by all types of
Surrounded by
enemies.
knives.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you add a little bit more to that,
Yes.
particularly around the civil rights and how he has
I think
drawn away from
yes,
them?
and you have to really face the music about this threat. Just like Lincoln, there was never an hour Lincoln was president when he was not in immediate danger of assassination. That's a quote from his bodyguard, Layman, Ward Layman. Same thing with Kennedy. And there was an assassination attempt against Kennedy when he was, after he was elected, before he was inaugurated, just like an FDR. He was down in Florida. The guy tracked him from Hyannisport down to Florida. He was arrested by Secret Service. Look it up. You know, he had dynamite to blow up the whole first family. And the same thing with Martin Luther King. The same thing with leaders of the civil rights movement. Anybody good was under this FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and this faction of Wall Street that controlled the Dulles and this gang of murderers who were working with the empire, with our foreign enemies. Those are our real foreign enemies. That is, the empire is our foreign enemies. So, under the circumstances of the South never having been reconstructed. Remember, that was aborted by this fool who got into the presidency in 1876, Hayes, and pulled the U.S. troops out, unfortunately, out of the South. They should have stayed there. And The Birth of a Nation is a lie, that movie. So the South was still a problem and had an effect on the whole country repeatedly. Backwardness, stupidity. They were good people too. So Kennedy had the same problem that Lincoln did, and also FDR. Kennedy wanted to actually solve the problem the same way Lincoln and FDR were attempting to solve the problem. Both Kennedy and FDR, Lincoln and FDR are interrupted by chaos and war and depression for FDR. But solving the problem meant industrializing the South, meant bringing them fully into modern times. And he also needed the votes of the Congress to back him up. Wall Street and the reactionaries in the South together had power in our government from the time we set up this country. It became intolerable in 1861 and blew the country up. But that didn't stop there, and Wall Street was recreated. So you had this enemy, including surveillance, including, agent provocateur. And one thing that Kennedy was doing, one part of his strategy as king and this movement was building up. Now remember, the whole black community was not united behind Martin Luther King. That's a myth, right? There was leadership, and they were courageous people. A lot of them were kids too, right? A lot of old people were nervous like old people today, right? They're like the boomers today, right?
Yeah.
So it took a lot of courage to do anything. But this was starting to change public opinion, especially after Birmingham. World opinion. And we were starting to build up allies abroad. We started to build up countries abroad that were going to be our allies, and they would be the majority of the world. Wouldn't that be refreshing to have powerful allies all over the world who are our friends, and they're of different colors and different religions and different nationalities and different languages and so forth, and all our friends? What a powerful combination that is, right?
Hard to beat.
That's hard to beat. That's a great world, and that's what he's trying to build up, and to build up a labor coalition. So by the time of the March on Washington in August of '63, he's got more support. He's building up the power to get something through Congress. You don't just want to say, I'm for civil rights, and then you go down, and that's the end of it. Not just get shot, but you just lose, and then what? You have to win. And guess what? They did get the Civil Rights Bill into Congress, and it went through. Guess what? It's like with Lincoln. They said he's acting too slow. Yes, and Frederick Douglass was right to pressure Lincoln on the rights of the black soldiers. And Frederick Douglass built modern Washington, by the way. I'll tell you about that some other time. But Lincoln faced the real problem. You have to win. How did the U.S. get rid of slavery? The Army got rid of slavery, didn't they? Isn't that true? And then we got a constitutional amendment that Lincoln wrote that got rid of it for good. But the Army was the one that freed the slaves. Who built the Army? Lincoln. And Frederick Douglass too. All right? Recruiting the black soldiers that made a difference. 200,000, that's tipped the balance. So, but without the Army, without a victory in the war, without having the power to do the thing, you're not going to win. You can do this, like this fool up in Boston, the abolitionist. What's his name? Garrison, who said, "Yeah, let the South go ahead and take the South out of the Union. Then we won't have any more slavery in America, will we? Because it won't be part of America."
Don't destroy the country.
Here, he had a question, right? Did you want to? Yeah.
With regards to JFK's position on Vietnam,
Yes.
I recently looked up a speech that he gave in 1954 as
Yes.
senator, where he, in no uncertain terms, is advocating a negotiated settlement of the situation in Vietnam. And also, it seems that he consistently,
For the French, who were then fighting against
Yeah.
the Vietnamese, like
Yeah.
we eventually later did. So
he
he's, yeah.
consistently seems to oppose U.S. getting militarily involved and
Right.
militarily intervening in Vietnam.
in combat.
And as Alvin just pointed out, he's surrounded by these reactionaries, and it's shocking to read that at one point the Joint Chiefs and the various other people around him were advocating the use of tactical nuclear weapons
Crazy stuff.
after the Berlin Wall went up. And I would go so far as to say, I would conjecture that the only reason we're here is, and that we exist, is because of JFK's peace negotiations and his, getting
It's true.
his opposition to the nuclear weapons. Because this group around him was pushing him,
Yeah, sure.
use these tactical nuclear weapons. Now, imagine what would have happened had we used tactical
That's
nuclear
right.
weapons
That's right.
against
He did back the setting up of a government that was set up in South Vietnam. This is a fallback option because originally we were supporting Ho Chi Minh. The United States was allies with Ho Chi Minh. He was not primarily a communist, he's primarily a nationalist. And so we were sending arms to him, and he was fighting the Japanese for us. And at the end of the war with Japan, Ho Chi Minh issued the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam, modeled on the United States Declaration of Independence, word for word. That's what it's about. And he sent this to President Truman and said, I want, first to Roosevelt, but then Roosevelt didn't have this opportunity. He sent this to Truman, who was the president when the war was over, saying, I would like the United States to take charge of Vietnam and guide Vietnam like you did Philippines to independence. And we turned him down under Harry Truman and the British. And the British engineered that the French Empire would take again control of this country that they stole, that the British gave them during the Opium War. What a betrayal of our own interests, as well as the people of Vietnam. How many millions died because of that? How many crazy communists got in, like in Cambodia and elsewhere, because of that? How much craziness is going to go on because of failure to just simply recognize that peace and stability and power are all you can do all those things together. Power is not wrong. You know, we want to have a strong military, and they're engineers, and they can make dams, and they can do all sorts of nice things. We want nuclear. We don't want nuclear weapons all over the world, but we want nuclear power plants. We want power for good, not for evil. That's the difference. Examine your heart. If you say it's too dangerous to have too much power, and it's only evil, and all there's been in the world throughout history is evil power, you are saying the devil rightfully controls the world, and you're an enemy of God. That's my point of view.